Mr. Eastwood, the judge smirked. Do you think this is one of your movies? The room laughed. The cameras rolled. But Clint didn't blink. He leaned forward, his voice low but unshakable. This isn't a movie, Your Honor. This is real, and I know the law. What happened next turned the courtroom into a battleground and left everyone speechless. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with people whispering and waiting. This wasn't just any trial. This was about Clint Eastwood, the Hollywood legend. But today, there were no cameras, no scripts. Clint wasn't playing a hero. He was being one. Outside, news vans lined the street, their satellites ready to beam updates to the world. Reporters clutched their mics, hoping for something big. But inside, the air felt electric. This wasn't a movie. It was real. At the front of the room stood Clint Eastwood, tall and steady. His face, carved with years of wisdom, showed no fear. His eyes, sharp, clear, locked on the judge. He wasn't here for fame. He was here for justice. The case was about his land, a piece of Carmel by the sea that he owned and loved. But a developer named Gerald Madsen had built luxury condos on Clint's property without permission. Clint had tried everything, letters, phone calls, warnings, but Madsen ignored them all. So here they were, in court, with Clint ready to fight, alone. No lawyer, just himself. The heavy doors creaked, and in walked Judge Wallace Bridger. A seasoned man with a sharp gaze and a smirk. He adjusted his robe and looked down at Clint. His voice, thick with doubt, filled the room. Mr. Eastwood, he said, tapping his gavel, I hear you've chosen to represent yourself? Clint, standing tall despite his 94 years, nodded once. That's right, he said, his voice calm and steady. Laughter rippled through the crowd. People shook their heads. The movie star thinks he's a lawyer? Even Gerald Madsen, sitting smugly with his fancy lawyer, let out a chuckle. Judge Bridger leaned forward, his tone dripping with sarcasm. You do understand, Mr. Eastwood, he said, that courtrooms aren't movie sets. There are rules here, real rules, and this isn't about delivering a monologue and riding off into the sunset. The laughter grew louder, but Clint didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He waited. And when the room grew quiet, his voice, low and firm, broke the silence. I know the rules, he said, and I know the law. The judge raised an eyebrow. Oh? He said, his smirk widening. And where did you study law, Mr. Eastwood? The laughter hit harder now, loud and mocking. But Clint stayed patient. Without a word, he reached into his case and pulled out a thick stack of neatly bound documents. He tapped the top page softly, his voice clear and unshaken. I've spent the last 6 months studying property law, he said. I've read every zoning code and case file. I've studied precedent. And I've brought enough evidence to prove that my land has been taken, unlawfully. His eyes, sharp as steel, met the judge's. So if this courtroom stands for justice, let's get to it. The laughter stopped, like someone had cut the sound. For the first time, the courtroom felt still. And everyone, reporters, jurors, even Madsen's lawyer, realized that Clint Eastwood wasn't here for a show. He was here to win. The judge cleared his throat, shifting slightly in his seat. Very well, he said, his voice less smug now. Mr. Eastwood, you may proceed. Clint nodded and sat down. His face, calm and unreadable, said nothing. But the room felt it, the shift. Nobody was laughing anymore. The courtroom, once filled with smirks and whispers, had fallen into a heavy silence. Judge Bridger, his earlier amusement fading, folded his hands and leaned forward. Mr. Eastwood, he said, his voice more measured now. You may begin your opening statement. Clint stood slowly, his movements deliberate and steady. His hands rested lightly on the table, his sharp eyes meeting every gaze in the room. He didn't rush. The silence became his ally, a tool he had mastered both on screen and in life. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but firm, each word landing with precision. In 1992, he began, I bought a piece of land in Carmel by the sea. It was more than just property. It was a part of me. His eyes didn't leave the judge's. For years, I paid my taxes, followed the rules, and respected every boundary. The courtroom listened, really listened. But last year, Clint continued, his voice steady, Mr. Madsen and his company decided those boundaries didn't matter. They built on my land, without my consent, no permits, no permission, nothing but greed. From his case, Clint pulled out a folder and laid it on the table, his fingers brushing the pages. I sent letters, I made calls, I filed complaints, every warning, ignored. He paused, his eyes meeting Madsen's across the room. They didn't listen because they didn't have to. They thought I'd give up. The room, still as stone, felt the weight of his words. Then Clint reached into his stack and lifted a series of photographs, clear aerial shots, taken before and after the construction. This, he said, holding up the first image, is my land, before. He slid it onto the evidence table. And this, he continued, showing the second, is after Mr. Madsen started building. The second photo showed the creeping invasion, the steel skeleton of luxury condos inching over his property line. The courtroom stirred, reporters jotting notes. The evidence was clear. Suddenly, a smooth voice cut through. Your Honor, said Gerald Parker, Madsen's high-priced attorney rising from his seat. Tall, polished, and full of swagger, he wore his designer suit like armor. If I may? The judge nodded, and Parker turned to Clint with a smirk. Mr. Eastwood, he said, his tone dripping with mock respect, I must say, I admire your dedication. But with all due respect, you're not a lawyer. Parker's smile widened as he faced the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, we're not in a movie. This isn't some Western where the hero wins with a clever line and a quick draw. This is a court of law, built on rules and expertise. He turned back to Clint, his eyes cold. You've read some books, but do you even understand the laws you're quoting? The courtroom chuckled again, a faint echo of their earlier mockery. But Clint didn't blink. His voice, smooth and steady, cut through the air. I understand the law just fine, he said, his eyes locking with Parker's. And more importantly, he leaned forward, his voice colder now. I understand when someone's breaking it. The chuckles died instantly, swallowed by the sudden tension. Parker, lips twitching, pushed on, his tone condescending. Mr. Eastwood, I get it. You're a fighter. You've made a career of it. But let's be honest. He spread his arms, turning to the jury. This is just a performance, a scene. He paused for effect. And scenes belong in movies, not in courtrooms. His smirk deepened. So, Your Honor, he said, turning back to the judge, I respectfully object to this entire charade. This case deserves a proper trial, not a performance. The room's eyes swung to the judge, waiting for his response. But before Judge Bridger could speak, Clint did. His voice, sharp and clear, broke through. You want a performance? He asked, his tone like flint. Go watch one of my films. His eyes, hard and cold, swept the room. This, he said, his hand cutting through the air to the courtroom, the judge, the jury. This is real, and I take real things seriously. The courtroom, so quick to mock, sat frozen. Even Parker felt it, the shift. The judge rubbed his temples, his earlier smirk long gone. Very well, he said, his voice quieter now, more respectful. Mr. Eastwood. His eyes met Clint's, and for the first time, they held something new, caution. You may proceed. Clint's face remained unreadable as he took his seat. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't made threats. But the message was clear. He was not here to lose. The air in the courtroom felt heavier now. The laughter was gone, replaced by a thick tension no one dared to break. Judge Bridger, his earlier smirk erased, leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on Clint Eastwood. "All right, Mr. Eastwood," he said, his voice more cautious than before. "Continue." Clint stood, his weathered hands brushing over his stack of papers. He moved slowly, with the weight of someone who knew that in court, patience wasn't weakness, it was power. "In front of you," Clint said, his voice steady and low, "are the facts, not feelings, not opinions. Facts." He pulled out a set of emails, printed, dated, undeniable. "These," he said, placing them on the evidence table, "are copies of every warning I sent to Mr. Madsen's company. First, a cease and desist notice, then a second, and a third. Every one of them ignored." The soft rustle of paper was the only sound in the room as he flipped each page forward. "They had every chance," he said, his eyes lifting toward the jury. "Every chance to do what was right. They chose not to." Suddenly, a chair scraped. Gerald Parker, Madsen's smooth-talking attorney, shot to his feet. His polished voice broke the silence. "Your Honor," he said, his smile thin and sharp, "this is all very heartfelt, but let's not forget, Mr. Eastwood is not a lawyer." He turned toward the jury, spreading his arms wide. "He's an actor, and a good one. But the law is not about feelings. It's about proof." His voice took on a playful edge. "I mean," he said with a smirk, "I've seen Dirty Harry." A few nervous chuckles escaped the gallery. "But with all due respect," Parker added, "this isn't a scene where the hero stares down the bad guy and the credits roll. This is court, and in court, we follow the rules." The room stirred, sensing another blow aimed at Clint. Parker, confident now, gave one last jab. "So," he said, his smile dripping with mockery, "unless Mr. Eastwood plans to solve this with a one-liner, I move that we dismiss this case due to his lack of legal expertise." Eyes turned to the judge. For a moment it seemed Clint's case was slipping, but then Clint spoke. His voice, calm as still water, cut through Parker's smugness. "You want a one-liner?" he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Fine." He leaned forward, his voice soft but sharp. "The law doesn't care who's holding the microphone. It cares who's telling the truth." The chuckles died, Parker's smile tightening. Clint wasn't finished. His voice, cool as granite, pressed on. "I may not be a lawyer," he said, "but I know when someone's stealing, and I know that no fancy suit, no smooth talk, and no courtroom trick is going to change what's right from what's wrong." The room went still, the silence louder than any shout. Judge Bridger, his lips pressed tightly, finally spoke. "Mr. Parker," he said, his tone now clipped and cold, "your objection is denied. Mr. Eastwood has the floor." Parker's jaw twitched, but he sat. His confidence cracked. Clint, his face steady, nodded to the judge. "Thank you, Your Honor." He turned, his eyes landing on Madsen, the man who had caused this whole fight. And in that brief glance, no words were needed, because the message was clear. This wasn't over. The tension in the courtroom felt sharp, like a stretched wire ready to snap. Clint Eastwood, calm as ever, returned to his seat, but his eyes never left Gerald Madsen, the man who thought he could take what wasn't his. Judge Bridger, now fully serious, folded his hands. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, his voice steady, "you may call your first witness." Without a pause, Clint stood. "I call Jacob Reynolds to the stand." The door opened, and an older man entered, his steps slow, his back slightly bent from years of hard work. His name carried weight in this town. Jacob Reynolds had been a land surveyor for over 30 years, and his reputation was built on one thing: The truth. Jacob took his seat, placing a rough hand on the Bible. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I do, he said, his voice worn but firm. Clint approached slowly, his voice low and respectful. Mr. Reynolds, he began, how long have you been surveying land in Monterey County? Jacob's eyes met Clint's. 35 years, he replied, his voice steady. I've measured every inch of this county. I know these lands better than most folks know their backyards. Clint gave a small nod. And have you surveyed my property before? Jacob's gaze sharpened. Many times, he said firmly, including the year before Mr. Madsen's company started building. The room listened closely now. This was evidence they could understand. Clint lifted a document. Can you confirm for the court, he asked, that this is my official property deed? Jacob adjusted his glasses and scanned the page. Then, with no hesitation, he nodded. That's correct. This deed clearly marks your land boundaries, and they haven't changed since you bought it. Clint's voice didn't rise, but it carried through the room. Mr. Reynolds, he said, in your professional opinion, did Mr. Madsen's construction cross those boundaries? Jacob's lips pressed tight. Yes, he said firmly. They built beyond the line, on your land. A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously. The air felt charged with the weight of the truth. But before Clint could say another word, Parker shot up, his polished shoes clicking on the floor. Objection, Your Honor, he said, his voice quick and sharp. Mr. Reynolds isn't a lawyer. He can't decide property rights. Judge Bridger, his eyes hard, nodded. Sustained. Mr. Eastwood, keep your questions within proper legal boundaries. Clint, unfazed, gave a slow nod. All right, he said. His voice, steady and cool, continued. Let's keep it simple. He turned back to Jacob. In your 35 years of surveying, have you ever seen a property line as clearly marked as mine? Jacob's reply was quick. Clear as day, he said, and I've never seen it disputed until now. Clint's eyes flashed toward the jury. No further questions. Parker, adjusting his cufflinks, approached the stand with a slick smile. Mr. Reynolds, he said, his voice smooth and practiced, you say you've surveyed land for decades? Jacob nodded. That's right. Parker's smile thinned. In those years, have you ever seen cases where property lines shifted due to mistakes in old surveys? Jacob hesitated slightly, then answered, Sometimes, but rarely. Parker pounced. Rarely, but it happens, doesn't it? Jacob's lips pressed tight. Yes, it happens. Parker's voice turned smooth as oil. So, it's possible, that Mr. Eastwood's boundary line isn't where he thinks it is? Jacob's eyes narrowed slightly. Possible, he admitted, but not in this case. The line was clear. But Parker's job was done. He turned back to the jury, his voice full of false reason. That's the thing about land disputes, ladies and gentlemen, he said. They're rarely black and white. With a satisfied smirk, Parker returned to his seat. The judge's voice rang out. Next witness? Clint, his expression calm but his eyes sharp, stood. Not yet, Your Honor, he said. His voice, cool as iron, cut through the air. First, I'd like to remind Mr. Parker. He turned slightly, his gaze locking onto the defense attorney. That blurry lines don't build buildings. Greed does. The room, silent. The air, heavy. And in that moment, everyone knew. The fight had just begun. The tension in the courtroom felt like a rope pulled tight. Parker had tried to confuse the jury, planting seeds of doubt with his smooth talk. But Clint Eastwood wasn't done, not by a long shot. Judge Bridger's voice, low but firm, cut through the air. Mr. Eastwood, he said, you may proceed. Clint stood slowly, his eyes cold and steady. "I'd like to submit additional evidence," he said, his voice clear and controlled. From his case, he pulled out 3 printed emails, their bold subject lines sharp against the white pages. "These," he said, placing them down with care, "are my official cease and desist letters, each one sent to Mr. Madsen's company, and each one—" He paused, his voice tightening with a quiet edge. "Ignored." The papers landed with soft taps, but they hit the room like thunder. Parker, already on his feet, shot forward, his tone quick and biting. "Objection!" he barked. "These letters only show correspondence, not liability, and as I said before—" His voice sharpened with a smirk. "Mr. Eastwood is not an attorney." But Clint was ready. He turned slightly, his voice steady but cutting. "No," he said, his gaze locked on Parker. "I'm not. But I am the man whose land was stolen. And those letters?" His hand rested lightly on the pages. "They're proof that I tried, again and again, to settle this the right way. Mr. Madsen," his voice dropped colder, "chose otherwise." Judge Bridger's eyes flicked to the emails. His voice, rough with thought, followed. "The objection is—" He paused, the weight of his decision filling the room. "Overruled. The letters will be entered into evidence." A small, invisible crack formed in Parker's polished confidence. But Clint wasn't done. Slowly, he turned his gaze to Madsen himself, the man who, until now, had sat smug and silent. "Mr. Madsen," Clint said, his voice cold as stone, "if you're so certain you're in the right, let's hear it from you." The air thickened. The courtroom shifted, phones raised, pens scribbled. Parker, his face tightening, shot up again. "Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Madsen has not been called to testify." But Judge Bridger, his gaze hard, lifted a hand. "Overruled," he said, his voice colder now. "Mr. Madsen, if you have nothing to hide, you may answer." The room, tense and still, turned toward Madsen. Madsen's jaw clenched, his polished exterior cracking slightly. But, with a slow breath and a forced smile, he stood. He adjusted his tie, his voice oozing false charm. "With pleasure," he said, his tone laced with arrogance. Clint's eyes, like twin blades, met his. "Tell the court," he said softly, "why you continued building on my land after receiving these letters." Madsen's smile thinned. "Mr. Eastwood," he said smoothly, "we believed we were building within the correct boundaries. Any overlap—" He paused, his lips curling slightly. "Was an unfortunate mistake." But Clint didn't blink. His voice, soft but sharp as a whip, cut through the lie. "A mistake?" he said coldly. "Then tell me." His hand lifted another page, a digital timestamp from Madsen's construction company. "Why did your team receive my second warning and continue construction the very next day?" The courtroom, silent. Parker's lips pressed tight. Madsen's jaw tensed. Clint's voice dropped lower, the steel in it unmistakable. "A mistake," he said slowly, "is when you don't know better." His eyes, piercing, locked on Madsen's. This was greed, and you thought I wouldn't fight back." Madsen's face, for the first time, shifted, the cracks widening, and in that shift, the whole room saw it. He was lying. The air in the courtroom felt frozen. Madsen, his confident mask slipping, stood stiff behind the witness stand. His polished shoes seemed to sink into the floor under Clint Eastwood's steady gaze. Judge Bridger, his voice low but firm, broke the silence. "Mr. Madsen," he said, "answer the question." Madsen's lips tightened. He straightened his tie, a nervous flicker of habit, then forced a smile. "Look," he said, his voice touched with fake charm. "These kinds of disputes happen all the time. Construction is complex, and sometimes lines get blurred." But Clint's voice, cold and sharp, cut through the air like a blade. "Lines don't blur by accident," he said, his eyes locked on Madsen. They get crossed. On purpose. A soft gasp rippled through the crowd. Reporters' pens scratched wildly on their pads. The tension was thick, electric. Then Clint lifted another page. "Let's talk about those blurred lines," he said calmly. "This," he held it up, "is your building permit from the city. It clearly shows your legal boundary. And this," he flipped to another page, his voice turning cold, "is a digital construction map from your site manager. It shows your condos pushing over the line." My line. The room, once noisy with whispers, sat in stunned silence. The proof was clear. Madsen's face hardened, but a flicker of panic flashed in his eyes. Then, suddenly, click. A polished voice broke the silence. Parker, Madsen's lawyer, rose swiftly from his seat. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, his lips tight but his voice slick as oil, "I object. These documents are out of context." Judge Bridger's eyes narrowed. "Explain, Mr. Parker." Parker's voice softened, playing to the jury. "These permits," he said, gesturing to Clint's pages, "are standard. And construction maps? They shift. Contractors make adjustments. Minor encroachments happen all the time. It's common, not criminal." He turned to the jury with a smirk. "Mr. Eastwood is trying to paint this as a heist." His lips curled, his voice mocking. "But what we really have here is a misunderstanding." A few jurors exchanged glances. The room, once on Clint's side, felt uncertain. But then Clint moved. He stepped slowly to the evidence table and without a word picked up a USB drive. His eyes, cold and steady, met Parker's. "You're right," he said softly. "Maps can shift." His thumb pressed the drive into the display monitor, and the screen flickered to life. "But," his voice dropped lower, sharp as steel, "emails don't." The screen lit up, an email thread. The courtroom's eyes locked onto it. Clint's voice, smooth and cold, narrated every word. From Gerald Madsen. To Site Manager, Madsen Developments. "I'm aware of the property line issue. Keep building. Eastwood won't push this far. He's old, and he won't fight back." The courtroom exploded. Gasps rang out, followed by hurried whispers. Reporters scrambled to record the bombshell, and the jury, wide-eyed, leaned forward, their faces twisted with shock and anger. Parker's face drained of color. "Your Honor," he stammered, This can't be." But Judge Bridger's gavel crashed down. "Order!" he barked, his voice slicing through the chaos. He turned, his eyes burning into Parker. "Mr. Parker," he said coldly, "care to explain your client's email?" Parker, rattled, fumbled for words, his polished confidence shattered. "Your Honor, this is taken out of context." But Clint's voice, low and cutting, broke through. "No, Mr. Parker," he said. "This is your client's context." His eyes, sharp and cold, sliced into Madsen. "You didn't blur the line," Clint said, his voice dropping to a flint-hard whisper. "You erased it." The courtroom sat frozen, waiting, and for the first time since the trial began, Madsen had no words. The room felt like a pressure cooker about to burst. The jury, the reporters, even the judge, everyone, was locked on the email burning across the screen. The words, cold and clear, were undeniable. "Eastwood won't push this far. He's old, and he won't fight back." A sharp crack echoed through the air as Judge Bridger slammed his gavel. "Order!" he barked, his voice slicing through the chaos. "This court will have order." The courtroom fell into a tense, buzzing silence, the kind that made every breath feel too loud. Gerald Madsen, his face pale and tight, gripped the stand with white-knuckled fingers. Beads of sweat glistened on his brow. His eyes darted toward his lawyer, but Parker's face had gone cold. His usual smirk flattened into something close to fear. Clint Eastwood, his face carved from stone, stepped forward. His voice, soft but sharp as a blade, cut through the air. "Mr. Madsen," he said, his eyes locked and unblinking, "is this your idea of a misunderstanding?" Madsen's mouth opened, but nothing came out, just a dry, broken breath. His polished arrogance had shattered, and all that remained was the raw, exposed face of a man who knew. He was cornered. Parker, his voice tight, shot up. "Objection!" he snapped, his polished mask cracking under the strain. "Your Honor, this is entrapment." But Judge Bridger's eyes, cold and sharp, snapped to him. "Sit down, Mr. Parker." His voice, low and flint-hard, left no room for argument. "We've all seen the email, and I intend for this jury to hear every word of it." Parker's jaw clenched, but he dropped into his seat, his face burning with frustration. Clint, unshaken, turned back to Madsen. His voice, steady and slow, pressed into the room like a rising tide. "You said construction lines got blurred," he said, his tone tight with quiet steel. "But this," he gestured to the screen, "isn't a blur." His eyes, sharp and cold, pinned Madsen down. "It's a choice." The jury, their faces grim and hard, stared at Madsen, and they saw him. Not as a businessman, not as a developer, but as a thief. The silence, thick and heavy, broke with Madsen's voice, tight, shaking, desperate. "Look," he rasped, his throat dry, This is just how business works. We negotiate, But Clint's voice, cold and clear, sliced through the excuse. "You didn't negotiate," he said softly, his words dripping with steel. "You took, because you thought I wouldn't stop you." Madsen's lips trembled. Clint's voice, harder now, cut through the lie. "You thought," he said, "that I was too old." His voice dropped, heavy and cold. "Too old to fight you." The words hung in the air, heavy and hard. Then Clint's voice, low and cold, rose. "Well," he said, his eyes burning into Madsen's, "you were wrong." The air felt like it had been sucked from the room. Then, suddenly, the courtroom doors burst open. A sharp clack of boots echoed as a man entered, his face worn from years of labor, his jacket dusty from construction sites. Clint turned slowly, his sharp eyes narrowing. "And who are you?" he asked, his voice measured. The man's voice, rough but steady, carried across the room. "My name is Daniel O'Malley." He stepped forward, his boots scuffing against the polished floor. "I was the site foreman for Madsen's project." Parker shot to his feet, his face pale. "Your Honor, But Judge Bridger raised a hand, his voice cold and final. "Quiet." He turned to the man. "Mr. O'Malley, you were not on the witness list." O'Malley's eyes, hard and full of something heavy, lifted to the judge. "No, sir," he said, "but I couldn't stay silent anymore." The courtroom buzzed, a low, rising hum of anticipation. Clint's voice, steady and sharp, broke through. "And why's that, Mr. O'Malley?" O'Malley's jaw clenched. His eyes, heavy with guilt, met Clint's. "Because..." His voice broke slightly, but pressed on. "I was told to keep quiet, told to cover up the real boundaries." The room exploded. Gasps, whispers, the sharp snap of camera shutters. Chaos. Judge Bridger's gavel slammed, once, twice. "Order," he commanded, his voice thick with tension. "Mr. O'Malley," he said coldly, "are you saying Mr. Madsen knew he was building on Mr. Eastwood's land?" O'Malley's voice, firm and full of regret, echoed through the room. "Yes, Your Honor," he said. His voice, heavy but clear, landed like a hammer. He knew. The room erupted into chaos. Gasps, hurried whispers, and the frantic clicks of reporters' cameras filled the air. Daniel O'Malley's confession had hit like a thunderclap. Direct, undeniable, and devastating. Judge Bridger's gavel slammed down, his voice cutting through the noise. "Order," he commanded, his tone sharp and cold. "This court will have order." The room, buzzing with tension, fell back into a strained silence. All eyes locked on O'Malley, the witness no one expected. Clint Eastwood, his voice low but steady, stepped forward. His eyes, sharp as steel, met O'Malley's. "Mr. O'Malley," he said calmly, "tell the court. Who told you to cover it up?" O'Malley's lips pressed tight. His eyes, heavy with guilt, flicked once toward Madsen, then back to Clint. "It was—" His voice cracked but pressed on. "It was Gerald Madsen himself," he said, his voice steady now. "He told me to push past the line, said if anyone asked, we'd call it a surveying error." A heavy gasp rippled through the room. The jury's faces shifted, shock, anger, disbelief. Gerald Parker, his suit tight around his rising chest, shot to his feet, his voice snapping with desperation. "Objection, Your Honor," he barked, his polished confidence finally cracking. This is hearsay." But Judge Bridger's eyes were cold as he fixed on O'Malley. "Mr. O'Malley," he said, his voice low and pressing, "do you have any proof of this conversation?" The room froze, waiting, and then, slowly, O'Malley reached into his pocket. "Yes," he said firmly. His hand came out holding a small black USB drive. "I recorded it." The room exploded. Cameras flashed. Reporters scrambled. The gallery burst into whispers. Judge Bridger's gavel slammed down hard. "Order!" he roared, his voice slicing through the chaos. "Mr. O'Malley," he said, his voice cold and sharp, "submit that recording to the court. Now." O'Malley stepped forward, his face tight but determined, and handed the drive to the bailiff. The courtroom screen flickered, and the speakers buzzed with static. And then, the voice. First, O'Malley's. "But Mr. Madsen, Eastwood's boundary line." Then cold and smooth, Madsen's voice. "Don't worry about Eastwood. He's 94. By the time he notices, we'll be halfway done. And if he does, we'll bury him in legal fees until he gives up. Just build." The room froze, gripped by the cold, cutting voice of Madsen's own greed. The jury's faces turned hard. Their eyes, dark with understanding. Madsen's face, pale and tight, cracked into fury. His voice burst out, hot with panic. "You!" he spat at O'Malley. "You traitor! You—" But his rage was too late. Far too late. Clint's voice, low and cutting, sliced through the tension. "You thought," he said coldly, his eyes burning into Madsen's, "that I was too old to fight back." Madsen's face twisted, his lips curling, his hands gripping the table edge so tight his knuckles went white. But Clint, calm and cold, delivered the final blow. "You were wrong." The courtroom buzzed with a raw electric tension. Madsen's furious outburst still hung in the air, but his anger didn't hide what had just happened. The truth was out. And it was his own voice that sealed his fate. Judge Bridger's voice, low and cold, cut through the chaos. "Mr. Madsen," he said firmly, his eyes hard, "sit down." Madsen's lips curled in frustration, but the weight in the judge's voice was immovable. Slowly, with a sharp glare toward O'Malley, he sank into his chair, his face burning with fury and something worse, fear. The jury's eyes stayed locked on him, no longer neutral. Now, they saw him for what he was. Judge Bridger's gaze swept to Parker, his voice heavy. "Mr. Parker," he said coldly, "it appears your client's misunderstanding was a lie." Parker's face, usually polished and smooth, cracked with tension. He stood slowly, his voice tight but reaching for control. "Your Honor," he said, his words measured but strained. "This recording, it may sound bad, but business negotiations are often taken out of context. My client was—" But Clint's voice, cold and clear, sliced through. "Stop!" The single word, soft but sharp as a knife, froze the room. Clint's eyes, hard as iron, locked onto Parker. "No more spin," he said, his voice low but full of steel. "We're not in a boardroom. We're not on a movie set." He stepped forward, his hands steady, his voice cold and cutting. "We're in a courtroom. And here?" His eyes, sharp and cold, burned through the lie. "The truth is what matters." A silence, thick and heavy, settled over the room. Then, Clint turned back to Judge Bridger. "Your Honor," he said, his voice low but unwavering, "I've presented my evidence. I've shown you my letters, my land surveys. And now?" He gestured to the screen, where Madsen's own words still lingered. "You've heard him in his own voice." The tension in his voice pressed into the air, tight and raw. "Mr. Madsen," he said, his eyes cold as ice, "knew, and he didn't care." Clint's voice dropped lower, harder as he turned toward the jury. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was greed. He let the word hang, heavy and final. And it's time that greed had consequences. The jury, their faces stern, their eyes locked on Clint, felt the weight of every word. Parker's voice, strained and clipped, shot out desperately. "Your Honor, the defense—" But Judge Bridger's voice, colder than before, cut him off. "I've heard enough, Mr. Parker." His eyes, hard and sharp, swept across the room. "This court has seen the letters, the photos, the surveys, and now—" His voice dropped like a hammer. "We've heard the truth from Mr. Madsen himself." Parker's jaw tightened, his lips pressed thin, his defense shattered. And then Judge Bridger's cold eyes settled on Madsen. "Mr. Madsen," he said, his voice heavy with finality, "do you wish to explain before we proceed?" The room froze, every eye on Madsen. His jaw worked, his lips twitching, his usual smirk gone. The man who walked in proud and untouchable, silent. Finally, his voice broke, low and cold. "I have nothing to say." But Clint's voice, sharp and final, filled the silence. "You've said enough." The courtroom felt colder now, the air thick with the weight of truth. Gerald Madsen, stripped of his lies, sat rigid in his chair, his face pale, his arrogance shattered. The man who had walked in with power and polish now looked small. Exposed. Judge Bridger, his face carved from stone, turned his sharp eyes toward the defense table. "Mr. Parker," he said, his voice low and commanding, "do you have anything further before we proceed?" Parker, his usual smirk erased, rose slowly. His voice, once slick and confident, was now tight with strain. "Your Honor," he began, his eyes flicking nervously to the jury, "I acknowledge the seriousness of this evidence. But—" He cleared his throat, his words reaching for something, anything, to cling to. "Mr. Madsen is a respected businessman. He has contributed to this community for years. And while this recording may sound unflattering," his voice cracked slightly, "I urge the jury to consider intent." A strained pause. "Yes," Parker continued, forcing his voice into something steady. "There was ambition, maybe aggression. But criminal intent? Or malice?" He shook his head, turning to the jury, his eyes thin with plea. "This was business, risk and reward, and in business, sometimes lines blur." His voice lowered, oozing a practiced charm. "So, I ask you," he said softly, his eyes sweeping the jury, "to look beyond emotion, to see not a villain," his voice almost cracked, "but a man who may have pushed too far but did not intend to steal." His words hung weakly in the air, thin and hollow. The room sat still, the silence cold and sharp. Then, Clint Eastwood stood, his movements slow, his eyes, cold as flint, fixed on Parker. And when he spoke, his voice, low and hard, pressed into the air with the weight of truth. "You're wrong. The single cold syllable. Final. Parker's lips tightened. Mr. Eastwood, but Clint, his voice rising with quiet power, pressed on, his eyes sharp and unblinking. You call this business? His voice, low and measured, carried through the room. But business doesn't ignore warnings. Business doesn't erase boundaries. His eyes burned. And business sure as hell doesn't mock a man for being old. His voice pressed colder. And think it's a free pass to take what isn't theirs. The room, frozen. Clint's voice, colder now, laced with steel, pressed on. Madsen didn't push too far. His eyes, sharp and cutting, locked on Madsen. He pushed because he thought he could get away with it. His voice, cold and firm, hung in the air. Undeniable. The jury's eyes, dark and hard, turned to Madsen. They saw him now. Not a businessman. A thief. Judge Bridger's voice, slow and weighted, broke the silence. Mr. Parker, he said coldly, do you rest your case? Parker's lips, thin and pressed, barely moved. His voice, small and clipped, slipped out. We do, Your Honor. The final piece. In place. Bridger's eyes, heavy with command, swept the room. Then we move, he said, his voice sharp and clear, to closing arguments. The air, tight, thick with finality. But everyone knew. The fight was already over. The courtroom, once filled with whispers and doubt, now felt like a battlefield after the final shot. The truth, sharp and undeniable, hung in the air like a cold wind. All that was left was judgment. Judge Bridger's voice, steady and firm, carried the weight of finality. We will now hear closing arguments, he said, his eyes sweeping over both tables. Mr. Parker, you may proceed for the defense. Gerald Parker stood slowly. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by something thin and strained. He adjusted his tie, a nervous twitch, before facing the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice tight with forced calm, what we've witnessed here has been dramatic. And I understand, his eyes flicked to the recording screen, now blank, that emotions are running high. He paused, his voice lowering into something slick and pleading. But the law is not about emotion. It's about facts. And the fact is, his voice pressed lightly, property disputes are complicated. He stepped forward, his tone oily with reason. Misunderstandings happen, construction is messy, boundaries shift, and yes, his voice softened, my client may have been aggressive. He may have acted unprofessionally. He paused, his voice lowering into a half-whisper. But did he steal? His eyes swept the jury, his voice a smooth coil of persuasion. Or did he compete? A soft beat of silence. I urge you, Parker pressed, his voice reaching, not to let anger cloud justice, because business, he said softly, isn't a crime. A small pause. His lips thinned, his voice dropping to a final, soft plea. So, I ask you. His eyes flicked across their faces. Judge my client fairly. The words, thin, empty, slipped into the air and vanished. Then, Parker turned. His seat creaked as he lowered himself. His face, tight, strained, defeated. The courtroom, breathless, waited. Then, Clint Eastwood stood. The air, heavy and still, seemed to bend around him. He didn't move fast. He didn't stride. He stood. Calm, steady. His eyes, cold and clear, met the jury. And then, he spoke. I've played a lot of roles, he said, his voice low, soft but steady. Sheriffs, soldiers, men, chasing justice. He paused, his hands resting lightly in his pockets. But this isn't a movie. His eyes pressed into theirs. There's no director, no second take, and no hero, with a clever line to fix everything before the credits roll. The room felt tighter, his voice, softer but harder, pressed on. This is real. His gaze passed across the jury, every face. And in the real world, the truth isn't hidden behind speeches. It's not buried in paperwork. It's here. His hand lifted, not to the documents, but to them. In what you know. His voice dropped, cold and edged with iron. You know what he did. A heavy beat. And so, does he? His eyes, sharp as steel, flicked to Madsen, once powerful, now small. You heard him, Clint said, his voice cutting through the air. You heard what he thought of me. His voice dipped, soft but cold, that I was too old. The air felt thin, tight. Clint's voice, raw but unshaken, pressed on. He thought age was weakness. He thought respect was weakness. He thought playing fair was weakness. His voice, hard and cold, hung in the air, but I'm standing here. A beat. And he's hiding there. His eyes, cold and sharp, locked with the jury. So, you tell me. His voice, low and heavy. Who's weak now? The silence, thick, deafening. Then, Clint stepped back, his hands, calm in his pockets, his face, unreadable, but his words, absolute. That's all, I have to say. The air cracked with tension. Judge Bridger's voice, cold and final, rose through the silence. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he said, his voice measured, you now have the case. The gavel fell, sharp. The courtroom held its breath. The battle was now in their hands. The jury filed out, their faces tight with the weight of the choice ahead. The heavy doors closed behind them with a dull thud, sealing them away from the buzzing courtroom. Inside, the air felt frozen, thick with tension, heavy with waiting. Reporters whispered into microphones, their voices low but urgent. Pen tips scratched against notepads. Cameras lingered on Clint Eastwood's face, calm, steady, unreadable. Gerald Madsen sat rigid at the defense table, his fingers tapping nervously against the polished wood. His lawyer, Parker, leaned in, his voice tight and sharp. Say nothing, he hissed, his confidence long shattered. We're not finished yet. But Madsen's eyes, wide, burning, flicked across the room to Clint, and in them, behind the panic, lay something colder. Hate. The minutes dragged. Then, a sudden buzz. The doors creaked. A bailiff stepped in, his voice ringing through the tense room. The jury has reached a verdict. A ripple of sound, gasps, whispers, swept through the gallery. Reporters rushed forward. Phones rose, cameras flashed. Judge Bridger, his face carved from stone, nodded once. Bring them in. The heavy doors swung wide. 12 faces, stern, unreadable, marched back into the room. The foreman, a woman with silver hair and a gaze cold as winter, carried a single envelope. The tension pulled tight, every breath, every glance locked on her. The bailiff stepped forward. Has the jury reached a verdict? The woman's voice, low and firm, sliced through the air. We have, Your Honor. The envelope passed from her hand to the bailiff, from the bailiff to the judge. Judge Bridger, his eyes scanning the paper, let the silence stretch, cold, sharp, unbreakable. Then, his voice, low and steady, shattered it. In the matter of Eastwood versus Madsen developments, he said, his words cold steel, on the charge of unlawful encroachment and property theft. The room, still. The jury foreman's voice, clear and cutting, rang out. We find the defendant, a beat. Guilty. The room exploded. Reporters scrambled, cameras flashed, gasps, shouts, the whirlwind roar of justice delivered. Madsen's face, white. His mouth opened in shock, his pride, his power, shattered. Parker, his voice sharp and desperate, shot up. Your Honor! But Judge Bridger's gavel cracked hard. Once, twice. Enough, Mr. Parker, he barked, his voice cold with finality. The jury has spoken. His eyes, hard as iron, turned to Madsen. "Mr. Madsen," he said, his voice like a closing door, "you stole what was not yours. You ignored the law. You mocked this court. And now," his voice dropped, heavy and cold, "you face the consequences." A final slam of the gavel. "I hereby order full restitution of Mr. Eastwood's property, and furthermore," his eyes flashed with steel, "I am referring this matter to the district attorney for criminal charges of fraud and conspiracy." Madsen's voice cracked, panicked, raw. "You can't—" But Judge Bridger's cold eyes sliced through him. "Watch me." The room, electric and wild, swirled around the fall of a man who thought himself untouchable, and the rise of a man who refused to back down. And through the chaos, through the flash of cameras, the buzz of headlines, Clint Eastwood stood, silent, steady, unshaken. The fight was over. The truth won. The courtroom, still buzzing from the verdict, felt different now. The tension had broken, not with chaos, but with justice. The gavel's final crack still echoed in the air, a sound of consequence, a sound of truth. Gerald Madsen, once smug and untouchable, sat slumped, his face pale, his power shattered. His lawyer, Parker, packed up with tight, stiff movements, his defeat absolute. The press swarmed, their voices like a rising tide. "Clint, how do you feel? Did you know you'd win? What's next for you?" But Clint Eastwood just smiled. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pose for the cameras. He simply turned, his voice low but clear. "I fought because it was right." A pause. His eyes, sharp and steady, met every lens. "And I won because I didn't quit." Then he tipped his hat. No grand speech, no fireworks, just a man who stood his ground. As he walked out, the doors swinging wide behind him, the world watched. And the story? The story became legend. This wasn't just a courtroom battle, it was a fight for truth. And at Legend Celeb Stories, we bring you stories like this, where justice, grit, and heart collide. If you felt the power of this story, subscribe to Legend Celeb Stories for more unforgettable battles, both on screen and in real life. Drop a comment. Would you have fought back like Clint? And don't miss a single tale. Hit that bell, because here at Legend Celeb Stories, every fight has a lesson, every legend has a voice, and every story deserves to be told.